Hello and welcome to the Forgeborn Finishing School. I'm Kckid and I'll be analyzing Forgeborn battles to help take your game to the next level. Welcome back. I'm back with Koar here for another episode. This time we're going to delve into some of the lore of the story, really just trying to give a recap. We've had a year's worth of events now. A lot has happened in the story. Koar and I just attended the storyline event at Worlds and had a ton of fun there and really kind of delved into the storyline, so we want to give a recap for those that may not have been following it as closely. And I think it'll be interesting to see. There's been a lot of what I would say is crumbs along the path that have kind of maybe would have led us to see some of the things that did occur as it did occur. One thing I did want to talk about real briefly before we get into that is the Digitize event that is going to be coming up. Forgeborn Finishing School is hosting a charity Digitize event, and part of that event, all proceeds are going to go to charity, and it's going to be your favorite content creators battling against each other. And part of that process is they're going to be using a double digitized fused deck. So one deck's going to be a Betrayer digitized deck, the other is going to be an Alloyan digitized deck that they bring to the table. And at any point during that tournament, if they draw a Digitize in their hand and they have an eligible target, they're required to use one of their actions to play Digitize. As the community members, you guys are going to be allowed to place bounties on the teams that you'd like to, essentially lose or however you see fit. And basically, once a team has a bounty placed on them, they're going to have to, if they ever draw in that match two Digitizes, they're going to have to spend both actions to play both Digitizes. So hopefully they have a Thundersoar in play, for those rare moments. But to place those bounties, all you have to do is go to the GoFundMe. The URL is going to be in the description of this video. And you'll donate. It has to be a non-anonymous donation. And then you're going to use the comment section after giving the donation. And they call their comment section Words of Support. You'll see here on the screen. So you'll use the words of support once you place a donation to name the team that you want to place a bounty on. And if you don't want to place the whole $30 for a bounty on a team, feel free to donate 10 and name a bounty. And other communities in aggregate can donate to that bounty and get it up to that $30 threshold to actually put the bounty in effect.
I'm going to love seeing somebody having to digitize their opponent's creature.
Yeah, well, it's probably going to happen in this tournament, so there's going to be some off-the-wall plays for sure, right? It's meant to be a lot of fun, real lighthearted, but I do believe the content creators we have in this tournament are also going to be going for the win. I think the first question that came into the Discord server when I got everyone together was, is this relegated to only bronze decks with Digitize? So someone's already packing a silver deck with Digitize and is ready for this thing, which is awesome. So that being said, again, URL will be in the description, and we'll jump into the meat of this episode with the lore recap. So, if you can remember all the way back 12 months ago to Gen Con 2022, that's where our first storyline event happened. And just prior to that, the story itself was released. And so to get everyone in the right frame of mind, Solace is an ancient world, but we're dropped into it in the midst of an ice age, where the people were affected by a calamitous ice age, and it kind of splintered each faction, or the people, into 4 factions that treated how to survive the ice age a little bit differently. So you have the Tempests, who embrace the elements and living out in the harshness of the new world and trying to live as nomads, essentially. You have the Alloyan that that turned to technology and machinations for survival. You have the Uterans, which are essentially the druidic people, or one with nature, that ended up actually moving underground, seeking the warmth that's underground, closer to the center. And then you have the Necrium people, or who use necromantic powers and harness the power of the undead, and not really worried about when it's cold, when you don't feel the cold, right? So that's where we jumped into the world, Gen Con 2022. And at that storyline event, our first meeting with some of these Forgeborns was Korok coming out of his isolation in the mountains based off of a feeling and refining his Tempest people. And when he refines the Tempest, he runs into another Forgeborn who is Sunder. And in the ways of the Tempest, Sunder challenges Korok to a duel to prove that he is the Korok of legend. You know, the Korok they all knew from long ago. It's got to be powerful enough to beat Sunder, the new Forgeborn. And then also, Sunder just probably wants, to be the best Forgeborn there is. That's kind of part of her persona, as we'll get in there. Korok does win, beats Sunder in a duel. And what I think is interesting is right after he amicably, gives her a hand to lift her up from the ground, that's when the Solforge changes to the Tempest Solforge. And then we see that the Tempest now control the Solforge. Korok and Sunder both don't really know what that means for the Tempest people or what's in store, but that's where we go from here. And that's the end of the Gen Con storyline, and we move into PAX.
Yeah, so in PAX 2022, some unknown force to the Forgeborns basically is calling each of them, and at first they think it seems to be that they're each just being called individually, but they soon start realizing that basically it's like a call to arms or for a champion, or they're all going to meet. And so one of the first things that occurs is, Sunder is there and Korok is there, and so Sunder immediately just goes all the offensive and attacks Korok, wanting to best him, and she does, beating Korok. And is on her way to claim the prize. In that process, they come across the Rust Moon, where the source of this magic was calling all the Forgeborns, and there's where Sunder runs into Steel Rosetta, who seems to have this, I don't know, like almost a malevolent force guiding her for a little bit. Her eyes are all black, and there's tendrils shooting out of her, and Steel, like in the story, like Steel Rosetta is almost like reaching out at her for help, but then goes on the offensive and just powers Sunder down.
Yeah, I liked some of the words they used there was like alien signature, corrupt feeling, black eyes, pitch black energy. Yeah.
Yeah. And then upon Steel Rosetta touching it, it turns into this silvery arc that would then be claimed by the Aloyan. For the prize. So with this one, the kind of the Aloyan come out on top, besting Sunder in the final phase, and like at the end, like Sunder's wondering how she survived, why Steel Rosetta didn't just finish her off, which I think kind of then leads us to the next one.
Yeah, a couple of things that I did kind of pick out of there too that I think is really interesting is one, there's a moment in that storyline where Cersei is getting close to the artifact, to the crescent, if you will, or the moon, and feels cold. And makes a remark, I haven't felt this in a very long time. And it's just so it's a different type of magic that seems, to potentially be bringing her back to life, or we're not really sure exactly how she's interacting with it. But just one thing to take note, and the only reason I bring that up is because a lot of these little nuggets, like the pitch black energy, the black eyes, the alien signature, like those moments, now we see, the first signs of the blight before we knew that the blight was a thing. And then the other thing I thought was really interesting in that same passage is Cersei feels the forgotten, which I think could potentially be a big later on piece down in the plot line. And that is all of the dead creatures and beings that lived on the planet before the Ice Age are all buried in the ice. And as we'll get to the storyline later, Cersei's now starting to sense these beings, the forgotten. And so potentially that's something that she can tap into with her undead abilities. And I think, it's worth noting, Stoneblade George mentioned in the Discord the Forgotten just recently, a week or two ago in the Discord. So something to keep our eyes out on.
Nice, yeah, good catch on that. I didn't even realize George had mentioned the Forgotten, but I remember reading about it. She's thrown into this icy water
Mm-hmm.
underneath the glaciers as they're breaking apart from all the battles and the magic forces at hand.
Well, and that's a really good point. Like, this is the first time that we see the ice kind of starting to break or melt apart in a weird way because of the magic of the things the Forgeborn are doing. Maybe related to the Tempest taking the Solforge. Who knows?
Or the last winter.
Yep. All right. So, from this point on, we moved into Fuse Fest, and that's where Set 2 that was the pre-release. So, Battle for Whitefang Pass. Really, a lot of Exalts come into play. It's the first time where we start to see Exalts. So, Cersei has come to Whitefang Pass to essentially dominate the new Exalt. She had a dream. She came to dominate the magic. And so the other Forgeborn are all meeting there, kind of coalescing a convergence of power. Ironbeard's fighting Sunder, and actually defeats Sunder, and Sunder's, taking it underneath an avalanche. This is the first time where we, one passage in there is where we get it here. Ironbeard's hammer is named Anvilon, which I thought was pretty neat. We don't get a lot of nuggets of Ironbeard lore. And then as part of that avalanche that buries Sunder and opens up the entrance to Whitefang Pass, inside the cavern, Nova finds a red crystal, and it calls to her, and it's called the Heart of the Serpent, which she recognizes as the Blight. And so after she saw the red crystal essentially, speak to her, tell her that it's the Heart of the Serpent, or she just knew it intrinsically as the Heart of the Serpent, and then recognize it as the source of the Blight. This is the image, from the Stoneblade website, and if you look closely, I don't know if there's something to be gleaned from that. It's kind of interesting. So I took quite a bit of time to look into it. It almost looks like a snake's head, with some kind of a green eye if you look close enough, but very difficult to tell, very nebulous image. But that is our first interaction with the Blight. So not sure if the image inside of there is actually a spoiler for later or not. But the Blight here seems to be using the Forgeborn, or quite possibly even illusions of the Forgeborn, to confuse each other. So there's a moment where Nova's fighting Ironbeard, but then we're not sure if it's the real Ironbeard, and Cersei's fighting, and we're not sure if it's the real Cersei at certain points, and they seem to be teleporting throughout the halls of the Whitefang Pass. But once we get in there, Ironbeard actually stops and tries to warn Nova not to use the Blight. So this is maybe our first instance of the outside of Steel Rosetta, where we know what the Blight is. It seems like it's trying to take hold of a Forgeborn. And then a Forgeborn of a warring faction stops for a second and says, hey, stop trying to use this alien power. Even though we're enemies, that's not the way. And then, very interestingly, at Fuse Fest, I was fortunate enough to be there, and I was playing Nova as my Forgeborn and actually got to fight the Blight. I don't know if the Blight, who was played by Shadow, one of the developers in the storyline event, had fought other Novas or not. But one of the story aspects, when you fought the Blight, and only 5 or 6 people got to fight the Blight, they were always given a choice to essentially give in to temptation. And if they didn't, the Blight got a huge buff and was much harder to kill. And so during our match, I was playing as Nova, and the Blight gave me an ultimatum that essentially said, I'm going to get a free Oak Father, or you can give in to temptation, and I will not get that Oak Father. It was at a very pivotal point in the match, and I had an inkling that if I gave in to temptation and said, hey, don't get the Oak Father, that it was probably going to work badly for all the other Forgeborn in the room. But I also weighed out that this is the chance to beat the Blight, or at least have a player beat the Blight. And so I essentially gave into temptation, didn't allow the Blight to have the Oak Father, which did give a lot of opposing, essentially every other Nova player in the hall had an Oak Father played against them for free. So I was not the most popular person in the room at that time, but it did enable me to beat the Blight. And so what we found out at the end of this Fuse Fest storyline is that Nova at this point wasn't corrupted by the Blight. And so I don't know if that had some play in it, if that agency was there or not. But just interesting to think about. So then it's all kind of culminates into a fight in the room with the red crystal. And it seems like every time a Forgeborn displayed some extra power or some, power stronger than they would innately have, some fissures would appear in the crystal. And over time, eventually the crystal shattered and seemingly released the Blight into the world. And at this point, the Ice of Solace begins thawing. I think this is where, we really get into the preparation for the last winter. And then one just interesting thing, with the epilogue is the very last moments of the fight. Everyone's trying to run out of the thawing White Fang Pass. And I just love this part where Cersei just seemingly doesn't care and is taking this opportunity to blast everyone as they're running away. With the theory, I'll just kill as many as I can so I can raise them up and create my army even stronger. So then Sunder stops to try to fight, and Cersei blasts Sunder, essentially, effectively, I believe, probably killing her. But then the Blight seeps into Sunder's mind and at first says, "Hey, I can save you." Sunder says no, and then the Blight shows her a future where the Tempest people essentially no longer exist or are dying, and says, "I can help you save them." And so then Sunder gives in. We flash forward a little bit. Sunder's alive, but they're carrying her to her burial, and they open up her burial shroud, and she looks very much alive, but with a very, black eye that's leaking Blight. And Sunder says, "Nothing happened to me. I didn't pay a price." And Korok says, I think you probably paid a price.
Yeah, I don't think I trust you.
Yep. So that's where we see a little bit of, maybe the actual underlying discord, because it seems like Korok and Sunder have an interesting relationship. We don't get a lot of the details, but it's like when they're fighting, right? And then when they go back to moments of peace, they just say, "Hey, you were doing what you thought was the best for the Tempest people, so I can get behind that, but we're not fighting now." So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And so I think after that, really, we jump into UKGE 23.
Yeah, so this I think is the actual battle for White Fang Pass to see who ends up controlling it. And so, part of it starts out with Nova fighting Ironbeard. And so, Nova knows kind of the tricks that Ironbeard has. He's kind of using, some stealth infiltrators. So she finds a location to set up her defense where she's able to use, like, the vines and the roots of the underground to basically, stop Ironbeard and prevent his assassins and stealth from getting in and infiltrating. So while she's got the upper hand and she's winning that, Sunder comes in and just starts attacking Nova, and Sunder is being aided by this blighter, this dark voice aiding her, telling her how to attack, what to do, or giving her boosts, it seems. So she overcomes Nova, and Nova has to retreat. So then Sunder turns her force onto Ironbeard, and he seems to just be, taking out Ironbeard, waylaying into the other Forgeborns, taking them out one by one. On her way to claim, claim White Fang Pass, which she, ultimately does, and Tempest has it. But while that's going on, Cersei has been fighting as well, and this is where Cersei comes to the discovery of a rebellion within the Necrium ranks, which would be led by Nyx.
Living Necrium. Not good.
And so at this point, Cersei and Nyx are fighting, and Nyx takes the opportunity to retreat out, but at this point Cersei's not able to turn her attention to Sunder, and so again Sunder was able to claim the White Fang Pass. So yeah, so I think it sets up an interesting civil war within the Necreum.
Yeah, I'm not sure we'll call it interesting because we all just expect the Queen Cersei to destroy the rebellion, right? We've seen this play out time and time again, right? The Emperor destroys the rebellion, right? No.
Oh.
It is interesting. I think there's a couple of cool uh, deck lore stories that kind of played out in and around this time frame that I thought was interesting as well. So if you have the time, we'll have also the URL to the storyline down in here, but you can go through and read some of the deck lore, and they just add little bits of information as well that are kind of interesting. One of them, I think, there was a epic battle of wisps and spell sprites that played into this battle as well that came out of there. I just found that pretty interesting. And then another one was that Cersei, just prior to finding Nyx, essentially walked into a chamber that predated the Solforge itself, or seemingly predated the Solforge itself. So I don't know if that's telling us these places of power, these exalts, are actually predating the Solforge, and the Solforge was created in answer to the Ice Age. Just kind of a question that we have out there. We don't really have an answer to. Just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting with the Soul Forge. I mean, that's where the Forgeborns get their abilities from it. And there's some things on it, like Steel Rosetta's on the Lores on her card, right? And they talk about how the champions will fight their way to the Forgeborn. If they survive through it, they'll gain the powers. So
That's a great point. That's probably something I should have mentioned early in the beginning. That is part of the base lore. Is that you ask why we have so little Forgeborns potentially? Is that each race, or not race, clan, people, they send their champions, or if they're strong enough, they set out on their own and they go to the Soul Forge, and if they can fight their way there, survive, and then I would say are accepted by the Soul Forge, or are able to accept the power of the Soul Forge, then they become Soulborn or Forgeborn. Um, so it does sound like quite a few people have made the journey, and these ones that we see are the only ones that have essentially survived. What we don't know how that plays into is Crux Cobalt, which is who we're going to talk about here in just a minute. So that's a great segue as we are going to start talking about origins here. So Crux Cobalt was the basis for the storyline event at Origins, and we learn the first time we meet him, Crux's sanctuary is on the fringe of Uteran territory. We're not really sure why he's there or how he got there right off the bat. But he had put off heading for White Fang Pass. He got the same kind of pull that the other Forgeborns were receiving. They were saying, hey, come to White Fang Pass, fight for this power. But he resisted it. Just kind of it almost seemed like he was too busy with his other projects, doing other things, didn't really give it the weight maybe that it should have had. So he put off going, and then now we catch up to him, and he's going after everyone has already fled. One thing that's worth interesting is that he uses old mechanics, very similar to Ironbeard, much different than Steel Rosetta. And it says specifically he's used those and rebuilt himself with a lot of those to stop those from dismantling him again. And so then we later find out that Steel Rosetta had dismantled Crux Cobalt and thrown him into a pit to be rid of him because of, essentially his beliefs in the old or archaic or legacy style technological advances. And so we don't know if Crux at that point was Forgeborn. I am going to go under the assumption that he wasn't Forgeborn at that time. But that's really a huge leap right there. We just don't know. What we do find out is, just so happens, she threw Crux in a pretty terrible place to throw Crux. Because it happened to be into a pit that was filled with Oros's fungus. Mycelium network, it's called. So I like to think of it as, Oros's underpits in there, just steaming life. And Crux was able to rebuild himself with Oros's mycelium network, his magic, and the kind of legacy technology that Ironbeard is built on, it sounds like. And so in using that, he had his circuitry learn regeneration. So this is an instance where we have kind of actually what I would say is like a melding of Aloyan and Uteran. You got biotechnology and then I don't know, nanotechnology, Aloyan technology. So his circuitry actually learns regeneration. But then, as part of the storyline, Crux makes it to White Fang Pass, where all the other Forgeborn power is latent. So essentially, all the Forgeborn have left, but the power that they used and exhausted there has left an imprint on White Fang Pass. And so Crux sets up shop, essentially, to learn how all of this Forgeborn power, the Tempest, the Aloyan, the Uteran, the Necrium, all can essentially coexist and start to build what I believe he calls his hive mind or hive net. So it's interesting. I think it kind of leads us to believe that Crux is wanting to assimilate or destroy everybody to create a like-minded being to harness peace on the planet, right? To get rid of war. So in my mind, he's very similar to Cersei, just with a different tactic. Right?
Instead of making them all zombies, you make them all robots.
Exactly. So we'll see how that plays out. Later on, I was told that at Origins, they were the players were given some agency, and I don't know the full details, but they were given some agency to pick what faction would be the most like-minded with Crux's goal. And the answer at that time was Utera. So perhaps that played into the Mycelium network and that thing, and how that played about getting Crux back. But now, hearing his hive mind goal, I'm of a mind that he more aligns with Cersei. So
Yeah, I mean, it seems Aloyan and Uteran have had like some camaraderie or like friendship in the past, or at least some joint work, because like Oros and Ironbeard, I think there seemed to be some kind of connection there, and even with Nova and Ironbeard, even though they fight, I mean, there seems to be something there besides just animosity.
yeah, definitely some further tie-in than as compared to the others. I would agree. And it does. I'd have to dig back a little deeper, but I believe Oros and Ironbeard, are the older two of their factions. Ironbeard, that's quite evident. Oros, that's not as clear. I'll admit I went into this with the assumption, just based off art and all those things, that Nova was maybe the younger, more reckless Forgeborn, kind of like Sunder is. But there's pieces of the story that allude to Nova being ancient, so that might not be the case as well. But
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of the Korok lore, I mean, he's ancient, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, he was already ancient and old and decided to like go into the mountains and then come back right after a lengthy exile on top of that. So
yeah, I think it's interesting when you talk about the Forgeborn, and we are going to get into the Forgeborn here pretty quickly. But I think of the Tempest, Korik is the old wise one, right? Of the Aloyan, Ironbeard is the more ancient of the two. And then Necrium, obviously it's Cersei. I don't know where we stand in Utera, so that is something I'm going to try to look into and get to the bottom of. Again, my gut tells me it's Oros, but I think both have been around for quite some time, comparatively to the younger Forgeborns or the other two. Moving on to essentially Gen Con 2023. Greg, feel free to take us through this one.
yeah, so this is the newest. I think most people are familiar with this, but if you're not, I mean, here we see kind of Korak coming out and having these questions on who is drawing all these champions to here. He feels the polling, and this is happening time and time again. So why is it doing this? What this force is bringing them all together, and like what's the purpose? And then he's got these conflicts on what the blight is and its impact on Sunder, and his concern for the Tempest because of that, as Sunder's one of the champions, and her condition. Something else interesting that's not in the lore piece but was mentioned by some of the SB staff was that nobody, I think, played Ironbeard. in the storyline tournament, and so there was the comment of like Ironbeard just doesn't show up.
That would be interesting if that plays, further into the storyline. That later we learn Ironbeard also had the same feelings Korok did and just said, "Nah,
No,
I'm too fishy. I'm out."
I'm too old for this.
Nice.
So yeah, it's not in the story, but it was just an interesting comment that they had mentioned that.
Yeah.
But the big thing around this one is Cersei just dominating and laying waste to everybody, and Sunder comes out and sees Oros just getting kicked around by Cersei, and the Oros basically collapses under Cersei's onslaught, and all of a sudden the sky turns, purple deep shade, and Sunder looks up and sees that the Solforge has shifted to Necrium control, and Oros is laying there like battered and beaten and seemed to being at the verge of just death at this point, when all of a sudden he starts emitting this black light and malevolence nature that Sunder starts feeling within herself even more now. It was just like a small part of her, but now Oros is transforming, and she is starting to transform as well while witnessing it. Whereas it seems the blight has taken over the both of them during this, and so that's what appears to be happening, this malevolent transformation. I don't know what caused that necessarily. I mean, I was playing Oros and Hellkite. Steven was playing Sunder, and we both had gone undefeated, so maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe it was because Oros and Sunder had the most flips during the storyline tournament. I mean, I flipped it every time. I think Nathis flipped it all but one time.
Yep, and when we're talking about flipping it, essentially there's a storyline event that we're each given a forge, and on that forge you had a consistent or persistent ability that you gained throughout the entire fight. But there's at any one point you could flip the forge to have access to a one-time extremely powerful ability. But when you do that, then from that point on you have a persistent negative effect. So having been at Fuse Fest before, I instantly thought, hey, this is the blight. Don't flip this unless you have to, because that's probably triggering the blight. So there's a lot of players that do believe the propensity of those Forgeborn flipping their forge throughout the tournament affected who ended up falling to the blight.
Or if you wanted to.
Yes. I do think it's worth noting, I feel like it was fairly safe to say Sunder was probably going to fall to the blight in the storyline event, unless something drastic happened with a player playing Sunder, that would have redeemed her. Oros was unexpected, Then you, Sam, Jesse, Steven, or sorry, not Steven, you, Sam, Jesse, all playing Oros and flipping like it was the coolest thing since sliced bread.
I don't think Jesse flipped, though. He did not want to flip.
Okay. All right. Well,
so he was trying to preserve Oros.
He was trying to save Oros. What a guy.
Yeah. I'm an old Shadowlands from L5R, so like corrupting,
Well, what I think this tells us is that there are only, two potential saviors for the world of Solace, and the only obvious choice is Cersei. So everyone get behind Cersei so we can stop the blight. Just give in. Come out, have your death day, be reborn in the light of Necrium. It'll be good.
I actually really like the lore behind. Yeah, you want to talk about the death day thing with Necrium for those that don't know?
Yeah. So, let's get into the Forgeborn. I think that's a good part of Cersei. So let's just start dropping through the Forgeborn here. We'll start out in Tempest Land. So go ahead and hit Korok.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about Korok. There's a lot of his stuff is ancient, and in the past, and we don't know how long, either he isolated himself or he was exiled. So there's some texts are just saying he went into isolation, and others says he came back from his exile. so could have been self-imposed. But yeah, I mean, one of the, I like reading the back of the cards. One of them here is like, wounded Korakic exiled himself to the mountains. Therefore he made peace with the elements. So, I don't know if he got damaged into a battle and felt like he wasn't doing enough anymore and just kind of exiled himself, and then
Mm-hmm.
came back in in Tempest's time of need potentially. He also just seems to be up for a good fight every time. Like a lot of this deck lore is like, yeah, let's fight, let's do it.
Yeah,
So
and it's worth noting, like, we don't have a ton of information on just the Forgeborns. So what we've leached out of the story we're trying to use, or what we're using off of those cards. And I do think it's interesting, that Korok was injured, exiled himself, because moving over to Sunder, one of her cards, essentially flavor text, is the Soulforge chose me to take Korok's place, and I plan to do what he could not, unite the Tempest clans. So potentially Korok was attempting to unite the clans and failed in a battle or a fight or something, and then exiled himself after failing to unite.
yeah,
Um, Sunder definitely seems like the young, reckless one to me that comes in and says, "Oh, Korok couldn't do it, but obviously I can.
I got this.
Yep, put me in, coach. I'm ready to play." Um, One thing that's interesting is that she lost an arm. So you can see in the picture here, she has a reforged arm. Not sure, that's the assumption that's metal and elemental power of some sort. Um, her card reflects that it's hot all the time, so it's probably teeming with elemental energy. And that her belief is that the Tempests are the strongest clans because they live within the elemental power of Solace. So the other people just can't simply be as strong because they don't live one with nature. Even the Uterans are inferior to her mind because they don't truly live one with nature.
Each of the other factions find a way to mitigate it, whether it's just by being dead or using machines and nano machines or seeking shelter underground. Tempests are
Mm-hmm.
like, nah, we got this.
Yep. The weak shall perish, and we will thrive.
Yeah, and we talk
Uh,
about when we're reading these off these cards. We had a conversation with George at Gen Con too, and he talks about how a lot of these are just kind of written in the perspective from that individual, and it's their beliefs, which may or may not be true, and so you could find like something conflicting from one person's point of view to another, and that's
mm-hmm.
kind of the story behind it, and something we get to investigate or find out hopefully in later stories. But a lot of these are like viewpoints from an individual, which again could be true or not true. And then they're also just points of interest that as fans come accustomed to and talk about and ask about, we could see more light in the future.
Right. Yeah. Great point. And so, moving over to the Uterans, digging into the lore for just getting ready for this episode, reading through some of this stuff. I think my biggest interest now is Nova. Like, Nova makes a lot of jumps into the plot, has a lot of battles, has a lot of seemingly important spots in the fight. But yet we learn nothing about her stance on anything other than she seemingly hates Aloyan. There's a couple lines within the story that would kind of lead you to believe she has something to go against the Aloyan. Ironbeard reached out to her to try to stop her, and that just made her more angry, seemingly. But then, I said before I thought she was younger. Seems like she's pretty ancient. So some of her cards here. We have always been a people in flux, and once again, as the world thaws, we must change. Um, so it seems like being one with nature, that's their belief, even though the Tempest would also claim that. Um, they're really just open to change and kind of going with the flow, um, you know. And so one of her stances is that now that the world is thawing, the Uterran people must return to the surface. So that's one of her missions, is essentially to, herald the Uterran people and move them out of the caves into the surface. And her stance so much is that she says to stand her ground is to die. Let us find our way back into the sunlight. So, again, not a lot of information about Nova, so I'm just really interested to see. Hopefully, she gets a bigger part here to come.
When we talked about the Gen Con thing, what was interesting to me, and I don't know, again, we don't know the mechanisms that made somebody become the Blight, how Sunder or Oros from the Gen Con story event, Sunder was already headed in that direction. Oros, some of the backstory with Oros is really interesting, but with Nova particularly, it seemed like they were incentivizing people, at least in the first round, if you were Nova, to use the blighted energy or flipping the Solforge, because Nova got additional benefit on there as well if you were playing Nova.
I wonder if that's from Fuse Fest with Nova. And it wasn't just me playing Nova beating the Blight. I think there was a couple other instances where Nova I believe it was the champion or the Forgeborn least likely to give in to temptation throughout the tournament. So I wonder if there was something with that.
Yeah, when we talk about Oros, like obviously, my main deck utilizes Oros, and so I've started looking at other Oros decks and reading it. And his stuff just seems fascinating. Like, obviously he has the Darkforge Drain, but the Darkforge is mentioned a lot on a lot of his cards. And what is that? Is that the Blight? I don't know. We couldn't get an answer on that. But like, Oros' veins slithered beneath his skin. He was changing again. Couldn't stop it this time. He had to run. Like, even before his blighting, there seemed to be some kind of dark nature about him. Or Oros hoped that neither Ironbid nor the Uteran people would discover the price he paid to save them. So again, like, seems to be some of those ties to Ironbeard and the Aloyan, but also this price that he had to pay.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got a few more here. The Darkforge spoke to Oros in his dreams. You won't save them again, not without me. You're too weak. So it seems the Darkforge is another malevolent force or a dark force or something. Is it the Blight? I don't know.
So that last card that you just read, that last flavor text, that is very Blight-esque, right? The Blight seemingly speaks in the person's mind and says you can't save your people. It's exactly how the Blight was able to draw Sunder down. And now we ended up with Sunder and Oros blighted. So, very. Part of me, yeah, I alluded to it at the beginning, but after digging into this, part of me wonders if all these little pieces weren't there before that told us Oros and Sunder would be the ones to fall to the blight.
Yeah, this cursed magic calls to me, always beckoning me to these exalted places. So again, in these story events, there's always this force calling the champions there, and Oros seems to recognize it as a cursed magic. So I don't know, it'd be kind of neat. Is the you have the Solforge, and there appears to be this Darkforge. Is the Darkforge the Blight? Are they against each other? Are they two opposing forces? So just really interesting on the Oros's cards that just kind of relate to this dark entity, this dark force that seems to have been there back in set 1, impacting Oros.
Yeah, and one thing I do love, this is kind of separate, but one thing I love about the story they're kind of weaving is that there's not just one evil, right? Or there's not one bad force, right? Like, I'm a self-professed Cersei fan in the storyline. Look, I know she's not a good person, right? I get into fantasy games and storylines because I can, go through storylines or act out pieces that, I wouldn't do in real life. And so Cersei is obviously a undead, genocidal dictator. I would say that puts it calmly, but yet there is another evil force out there that is different, that is separate. And so right now we have the Necreum owning the Solforge or having control of the Solforge, but yet the Blight's out there too. So it's just going to be interesting to see how these two forces clash, and then the other clans as well. Moving into the Aloyan faction, so Ironbeard is also one that we don't get a ton of information on. throughout the storyline. We actually, I would say, got more on Crux and Steel Rosetta throughout the storyline. But you can kind of put a couple of pieces together, in that he is a more ancient Aloyan Forgeborn, probably one of the, probably close to, if not one of the original Aloyan, that came out of, you know, the original Ice Age, and where they started playing with different technologies to survive, because there's a very distinct difference in their body types, and then disdain on Steel Rosetta's part, when interacting with Ironbeard, and his old technology. So, one of Ironbeard's flavor texts is Ironbeard tore his hammer, which we later find out is named Anvilon. It's a pretty cool hammer name, big fan. From the head of the dragon, what challenges were left in this world? So it kind of just leads you to believe, look, I've been here a long time, I've done it all, I've seen it all. Obviously, he has a relationship with Oros, who has a relationship with the Dark Forge Drain, which is interesting. So I just think Ironbeard is kind of the old wise Aloyan who typically preaches caution, is smart enough to see the effects of the blight in Nova and say, hey, even though we're enemies, we were once all of the same people, and don't use the blight to just for this momentary gain, essentially. And then it's worth noting that at some point, Crux's old programming was used or modeled after Ironbeard, and was done so in a way to be impervious to Steel Rosetta. So I would guess that, not all things within the Aloyan faction are copacetic. Steel Rosetta is obviously, I would say, trying to take control, but simply can't do it, based off of Ironbeard's old technology, and obviously has a following because he's been around for a while.
Yeah, and you talk about the conflict with the Aloyan. We've kind of already talked about the conflict within Necrium, the conflict between Sunder and Korak. We haven't really seen that with Utera, but I think we're going to start seeing that now.
Yeah.
With Thoros' transformation. And Steel Rosetta, again, we've seen her in some of the story things. Her, the interesting aspect about her, and again, this is just kind of going off of, again, some of the back of the card kind of reading, is like, it seems to be like the Solforge itself is kind of like worshipped among the majority of people, or it's, something like Strifor, whereas to her, she doesn't see it as like, she sees it as like a technological wonder, like something to study, like it has a purpose. What is it for? Like, it's not she doesn't see it as some like divine entity. As well as like when champions, we spoke to the when champions gain their Forgeborn abilities, she doesn't see it as random. She sees it as, some kind of like they were giving it to them for a purpose. It's a riddle. Like there's something behind the reason why they got it. There's some like physical law or nature of how they got the abilities that they have. And so, yeah, it'd be interesting what those come out to be if we get to see more storyline on her research and uncovering of what the Solforge is and what it does.
I do love all of those things that you mentioned. There's a part of the storyline that you can read where Steel Rosetta mentions that her body was built and tuned, by her to be a data-centric entity. As she's walking into White Fang Pass, all the Forgeborn around her are worried about battle, but there's moments where she's simply not worried about battle. She's just taking measurements and annotating and trying to learn. Her body's just absorbing it, and that's why she thinks she's the superior being, because she can look at it analytically and try to assess what's going on and how best to use it. So very devoid of passion, seemingly, and scientific oriented.
Yeah, we've kind of already talked about with Crux in the origin story, so not a whole lot more to go on that since he's newer. Move into Necrium here, and I'll cover Nyx and let Ryan finish off with his crush, Cersei. Yeah, the interesting about Nyx is, we've kind of talked about with the undead having those that have perished having the in the Necrium having the power, essentially. Nyx, feels she has to stay hidden. We've already seen that she's kind of leading a rebellion, but unlike the other Forgeborns in Necrium or any positions of power, she's still living. Um, so that's kind of the big takeaway from her is like she's still alive, and that's not something I think Cersei likes to have. So,
Right. Can't have those smelly living humans laying about. Essentially, Cersei feels like, I mentioned before, is like the dictator who has solidified power and is just reigning supreme, without any, hint of discord. I would say for a very long time. That's why she was so surprised, I think, when she found Nyx. Um, but essentially, so Cersei has taken over the Necrim faction, has implemented a caste system, and essentially, if you're a living person within the Necrim society, you're on the lowest rung. And depending on what service you performed in life, you could kind of either accelerate your way into undeath, or when you do die, you would start at a higher level caste within the undead society. Um, but the basis of it is all undead are higher in the caste system than the living. Um, so much so that even some of the living with very powerful abilities are ranked below some of the very menial undead. It seems, but once those living ones get to their death day, which isn't typically accidental, it seems to me that that's kind of a ritual performed. Like once you've done your service enough to the queen or the Necrim people, then you get to go through the ritual where they murder you in some way, shape, or form, and you get to come back to life at a higher level or higher ranking in society. And so just not a lot of dissent until we learn about Nyx Nikaya leading the rebellion. So I'll read the flavor text on Happy Execution Day is what it's called. So from these merry gallows your bodies die, but new citizens rise. Happy Execution Day. So I call it Death Day, but Execution Day. And then I
celebrated
guess,
yearly.
yeah, yep. Another quote that I like: "Life is short, death is forever. One must live only to be elevated among the dead." So basically, you probably get really deep into this. We won't get too deep, but life is your service, and then your death or your everlasting after that is where you're raised up and you get to be a little bit higher in society and no longer perform the menial functions of the living in this society. So that is the Necrim. Pretty dark people. Now the rulers of the Forge.
They have they have like a yearly holiday. I didn't see any holidays on the other factions.
That's true. Uh,
And all the living just get to be like children until
yeah.
until their
I would
execution
have to guess they're piling gifts around the gallows.
day.
Doesn't sound too bad, right? Maybe a little I don't know, spice cake for the event. All right, so that really gets into and wraps up our recap of the lore. This took quite a while. If you made it through with us, we appreciate it. But really, it was kind of an undertaking, I think, to go through and reread all the lore and try to catch up myself. So hopefully, you guys appreciate the recap. I loved having someone else to go through it with me, so appreciate it, Greg. You caught some things I didn't in the storyline. I think I just caught a couple of nuggets you didn't as well, so it helped us get a better picture of it. And I do want to say that I think it all stems back to you reading one line off of Oros. And we're playing a game. You said, "Hey Ryan, have you read this stuff about the Dark Forge strain?" I was like, "No. What are you talking about?" And then we talked for 45 minutes about story. We got really deep into it. And I wouldn't have had as fun a time at the storyline event at Gen Con had we not had that conversation before. So I think that really amped me up for it. So hopefully, as more storyline events come out, we can do another one of these things. One other thing I wanted to put out that essentially also kind of gave me the idea for this is I was talking with George at Stoneblade, and mentioned how other games had eventually got to the point where they were putting out novels or stories and things of that nature, and like has it baked in here in Solforge. And so he had mentioned that, at some point maybe there'll be an anthology or a collection of stories that's sold in print. And my mind went straight to like coffee table book. I would love to have a coffee table book that's got all the storyline event lores, the deck lores, all the pictures.
Oh, that's some amazing artwork.
Yeah,
too.
That'd be cool. And so that kind of just made me think, well, hey, if I would like seeing it all in one place, maybe we could do a video. So that being said, I think we'll wrap it up here for the night. Thanks for attending this lesson.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for attending this lesson of the Forgeborn Finishing School. If you like this video, please subscribe, comment, or consider donating to our Patreon account. I'm Kckid, and I look forward to our next lesson.